This is the Cole Memo. I am your host, Cole Preston. Every episode is released in audio, video, and transcript format. To find the transcript, audio, or video version of any episode, please refer to the description of the episode that you're listening to. Within that description, you can find a link that will take you to our website, which will display the transcript for this episode and the platforms where you can find the episode in audio and video formats. If you're unable to locate the episode description on whichever platform you're listening from, I get it. Every platform's different. So just simply note the episode number, and then you can visit thecolememo.com. From there, you can find the corresponding episode. Then you'll be able to find that audio, video, or transcript version. You might also find any links that we referenced during the show so that you might be able to do your own research or get connected with cool people like the guest I have today. If you're not listening to this episode of the Cole Memo on Patreon, then you're listening to this episode a bit later than our patrons. To become a patron, go to thecolememo.com/Patreon. Once again, that's thecolememo.com/Patreon. It's a great way to support our show, but one of the best ways to support our show is absolutely free. Subscribe to or follow our show, share it with your friends, tell everybody about it, favorite it, give it a thumbs up, whatever. Your engagement and support is appreciated. Today is November 21st, 2023. We're approaching Turkey Day. And for all those reasons, I'm thankful to be joined by Kurt Kaufmann from Seed Talent. Kurt, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us where we can find you online?
Yeah, absolutely, Cole. Thanks for having me on today. So, as Cole mentioned, I'm Kurt Kaufmann. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Seed Talent. You can check us out at seedtalent.com or on Instagram at Seed Talent. To give a little bit of background on myself and just the company, Seed Talent has emerged as the largest employee enablement or training platform in cannabis. We support over 1,500 dispensaries across 25 states, working to really support those frontline professionals, the bud tenders, as the vast majority of our audience, really working to bring together all of the training they need into one central hub, and then ultimately leveraging data to deliver that training to the right folks at the right time. And I've been in cannabis now going on 7 years on the legal side. Started with Green Thumb Industries as a relatively early employee, kind of worked throughout their business on the sales team, founded their internship program, founded their wholesale and retail customer service teams, as well as ultimately launched their cannabis onboarding program, which led into the launch of Seed Talent. I'm super stoked to be talking with you today. Longtime listener of Chillinois originally, and excited for the transition to the Coleman. I think you might be muted, Cole.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your support. And once again, for folks, it's seedtalent.com. We'll have that link in the podcast description. Thank you again for your support. And that's one of the things you mentioned when we first met. Maybe that's where we can start. I was at Benzinga Cannabis Capital Conference. And you know what? Honestly, if I went back through the footage, I might even have the moment where you approached me on tape because I was getting ready to record. So I was doing like a sample recording to get like levels and such. And yeah, it was just kind of cool because you were one of the first to approach me and make me feel like a celebrity. Like, you're Cole, right? From the Chillinois podcast. I'm like, oh my God, people know me. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to feel cool.
No, absolutely. I've been a long time fan, and I think cannabis is super integral to like my entire adult life. And I think what I've come to learn is there's like different voices and different perspectives that make this community as strong as it is. And I think as I mentioned at Benzinga, while I don't agree with every take you have some takes that I think are very important for the industry, and I think you have a perspective and a way of challenging some of the status quo that I have found interesting. And so I wanted to introduce myself and see if there's an opportunity to meet. And I appreciate you taking me up on that opportunity.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I would love to get back to maybe some of the things we disagree on because I love to talk about those things. But
Sure.
And for you to, I remember that distinctly, for you to bring that up when you met me. I was like, I am looking forward to speaking to you, Kurt. So thank you for being like kind of on your sleeve about that. But before we get to all that, tell us a little bit more about Seed Talent. What is Seed Talent and why should people know about it? I mean, I'm assuming it's like if you're trying to get into the cannabis industry, then you need to know of Seed Talent to get connected and stuff. But tell me.
Yeah, No, I appreciate the opportunity to do so, and that's a good kind of misconception, I'd say. So,
Okay.
really, Seed Talent was born out of. So, as I mentioned, I started on the plant touching side, working throughout the business with GTI. One of the things that was my primary responsibility was I was on the sales team that covered the Illinois medical market, and then ultimately the transition to RAC. And I think one of the things that became painfully at times obvious is there's a lot of folks that want to work in cannabis, but they fundamentally lack a lot of the cannabis specific knowledge to really add value, in their first 30, 60, 90 days, sometimes ever. And so within Green Thumb, launched their cannabis onboarding program, trained about 700 salaried folks for them, and then said, hey, there's a real opportunity. If one of the bigger players in the space is having challenges, getting educated staff, let's take a look at this market. And when I kind of thought back, I was pretty active out in the market visiting stores. And I think one of the big challenges of our industry is we're frankly, as an industry, completely dependent on frontline bud tenders, frontline retail employees to educate the entire country on what is cannabis, how to safely consume it, what are the products, how to buy good, better, best. Like, what is the cannabis shopping experience is right now really being defined in our retail settings. And so when we looked at launching Seed Talent, the challenge that we wanted to solve initially is how do we bring together all of the content that these folks need to be successful, whether it's federal and state compliance training, company and corporate onboarding. That's what most people think training is. But where we really, I think, focus is we do a lot of product training. So in Illinois, we represent about 90% of the brands in the state. We work with virtually 100% of the dispensaries. We do all the compliance, all the onboarding for a lot of those groups. But one of our big, I think, value adds within the space is we work with the vast majority of the brands to help provide education on who their brands are, what are the products, how to sell it and connect that with consumers and patients, all through the platform. And while we started in Illinois, we've now got about 40,000 cannabis professionals that train through the platform. Last month, we passed over 500,000 completions on the platform. So we're getting a lot of engagement because I think ultimately this is a passion-based industry. Folks are hungry for that knowledge, and we're just trying to be the vehicle to more efficiently deliver that. So we create better outcomes for our patients, our customers, and ultimately a better employment experience for the folks that are working in our industry.
Yeah. And so part of this, as you kind of alluded to earlier, I mean, it seems like it touches on all facets, but one thing that you mentioned you wanted to specifically talk about was the role of bud tenders in purchasing products. How does that relate to, I'm guessing it has to do with the information that they learn, right?
Yeah, big time. I mean, I'm like a big believer that what has made cannabis, aside from just like it being an amazing like plant and like the experience personally, in terms of like psychological experience being, awesome. I think one of the things that draws people into cannabis is the community. And I think a lot of times that word has gotten hijacked with kind of, BS different things that are happening in the space, the community, the community. But the reality is like cannabis is a community in itself. There's no like there's certainly socioeconomic backgrounds and race backgrounds and all these different things. But one thing that I've found, whether it's standing outside of a concert, whether it's at an industry event, is you can all be bonded over the fact that you love getting high and smoking weed. And I think one of the things that for me was so impactful in that is every step I took in going from smoking out of an apple in a buddy's truck to, advancing to, concentrates and all the other things that ultimately came along the way is someone in my circle cared enough about my consumption, my love of the plant, my connection to the plant to make the connection between a product, a strain, whatever it may be, and my use case. And I think one of the things that is a real challenge in our industry right now is both bud tenders at times, as well as corporate leadership, look at that interaction as a retail interaction. And that's like just fundamentally like not what it is. It is I look at bud tenders as guides along somebody's cannabis journey. And ultimately they have to stay educated. They have to stay, on top of just not just the information but the ability to experience those products, get deeper understandings to ultimately continue to connect people to the right products. Because I think that's like the challenge, right, is how do we create a bigger tent where, and this is a lot of the stuff that I've heard you talk about, in terms of exposing the industry, exposing plants, challenging the status quo. Like that comes from education and confidence in what is the cannabis consumption experience and journey. And so for me, I think the role we play is really trying to be there to to provide those folks with the support they need to be able to have educated conversations. But the flip side of that is it takes people taking that job seriously enough to understand that they could be the make or break between that customer falling in love with the plant or saying, oh man, that was a terrible experience. I'm going to go back to whatever Western medicine I've been using or no solution whatsoever. Like those interactions, I think, are that impactful. And I think that role from everything from price compression to turnover to industry acceptance really starts with that interaction at the point of retail.
Yeah. Very interesting stuff. Yeah. Thank you for breaking it down. And you brought up price compression. I feel like that's maybe where we start to disagree. But I wanted to ask, as far as, what did you mean earlier when you said employee enablement focus? Before we start getting to that stuff, I want to just keep talking about things that I don't already
Oh, no,
have opinions about. I want to
yeah,
learn. You know what I mean?
no, absolutely. So employee enablement is a little bit more like, so that's a term to a certain extent that Seed Talent has tried to coin. Like one of the things that I'm pretty forward about is like, can I swear on this podcast?
Fuck yeah.
Okay. Nobody gives a shit about training. Like I get that. What people care about is the outcome of training,
Mhm.
which is better patient and customer, outcomes, lower turnover, higher confidence in your role, the ability to sell good, better, best, and not just sell highest THC to lowest dollar. That stuff really comes from enabling your employees to have success. And so when we talk with leadership, and we work with most of the multi-state operators, we work down to single store mom and pops, and it's the same conversation. It's like everybody conceptually agrees that training is something they should do, but they don't prioritize, they don't pay for it, they don't make the time unless they're actually seeing outcome-based results from those efforts. And so that's a lot of what we do, is try to go beyond just the check-in boxes of training to, can we actually tie those to business outcomes that align, the employee's desire to be more confident, to know more, the consumer's desire to have a more educated person on the other side of the counter, with the challenges that corporate has with allocating the time or paying for that. And 280E plays a big role in that, that in our industry, because you cannot deduct employee expenses, training is something that normally you'd be able to deduct
Oh, yeah.
as a result. And so we really focus on enabling your employees to maximize those outcomes for the business and for your patients and customers, rather than training, because training is the thing you do to enable your employees to the outcomes that you're ultimately seeking as a business.
Gotcha. Thank you for breaking that down.
Yeah.
Thank you for breaking that down. Well, that's very interesting. I didn't even think about like how that could come into play. Like they talk about the different ways in which write-offs impact them and how they're not able to write things off, but I didn't think about it in a way as traditional as that. Like I feel like most people have started a new job and have had to go through training and may not have even realized that their employer was able to write that training off, right?
Yeah. The impacts of 280E, I don't think, can be understated. And between 280E and the limited access to capital that our industry has faced, I think they'll write books, not a book. They will write books about how many challenges that has created for our industry. And I think training is just another one of those things that you can't write off investing in your people. And yet one of the big industry challenges we have is employees not feeling invested in.
Yeah. Well, you'll appreciate this plug, Kurt. Anybody that likes what they hear and would like to take advantage of Seed Talent, you can go to seedtalent.com/demo. Would you say that's correct if they want
Yeah.
to
So
proceed?
if you want to proceed and you have a business of any kind, retailer, extraction, cultivation, processing, schedule a demo. And we're making some updates to the website as we speak, and that's why it's kind of white at the moment. But if you're, a general consumer, general industry participant, you can also sign up for Seed Talent for free. You can get access to over 10 hours of free cannabis foundations training. The platform is more B2B focused. So the demo would be more if you're a license holder in any
Right.
way. But you can sign up for Seed Talent, take free courses. I'd encourage the Intro to Cannabis course. It's a 2-hour course, and I will guarantee if you know everything in that course, you'll know more than 90% of people who work in cannabis.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a new grown in email just came out. I need to turn my phone on do not disturb. My apologies.
There we go.
Um,
Brad's out there doing the good work. I see that.
yeah, he's doing the good work. I saw cannabis pop up and I was like, ooh,
Yeah.
something. So well, cool. Thank you for breaking that all down. Once again, seedtalent.com. Yeah, I'm just curious. I've got a bit of JB Pritzker's speech pulled up from Benzinga that talks about price compression, because of course it's not that I don't understand it, and I wouldn't even call it my critique of the industry, but I point it out a lot because it is the foundation, I would say, of the industry. Like preventing price compression in Illinois, I feel like is foundational to the success of the market.
I agree with that, and I think it's important to align on the definition of price compression. Price compression is in theory the compression, the lowering of prices as a result of oftentimes undue industry pressures, things that are happening that are not necessarily intentional, and that's in the flip side of what a brand is the brand is in theory the ability to get incremental margin over and above the commoditized price for a good. And so if you get water, and water is $1 a gallon as a commodity, but you buy Aquafina for $2.50, that an extra $1.50 is the brand's value over and
Right.
above the commoditized price. Price compression is, I think, is just important as we talk about Illinois, where Illinois, I think some of the biggest challenges with our pricing is not, in fact, the core pricing. To a certain extent, there's opportunities for efficiencies. There's no question about that. But the biggest challenge I think that Illinois is getting from the pricing standpoint is our taxation. To be looking at between 35 and 40% on a retail tax is beyond offensive. And I think it's easy to justify in terms of passing legislation. You got to get folks on both sides of the aisle to see value. But once the market is in a year plus of maturity and the sky has magically not fallen, I think at that point we need to start talking about who do some of these policies serve, and is it the people of Illinois? And whether it's taxation, whether it's the fact that you can't buy medical at every dispensary in the state,
Right.
there's just real conversations I think that need to be had about who's being served by some of these rules and regulations. And the reality is, oftentimes, no one is. It's just like hasn't been thought out correctly and
Mm-hmm.
needs to ultimately be addressed. And I think that's some of the work that's really important, that's going on from a variety of different folks, whether it be yourself, whether it be Shawnee Williams from Equity Staffing, Illinois Equity Coalition, some of these different groups that are just challenging some of these things where you're like, no one benefits from not being able to buy medical product at every dispensary in the state, right? Like there's just literally no one benefits. The producers don't benefit, the retailers don't benefit, like no one does at this point. And I think the taxation is another piece of that, but the price compression is a little bit of a separate thing.
Yeah. Let's talk about taxing for just a second.
Sure.
Oh, wait, taxing. What did I have to say there? It just totally. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I just about lost that one. I have trouble putting this one into words, but
Sure.
to your point, you just said it really. I thought that was really well said, what you just said about taxing and like the idea of who's it serving, who's it helping, like that whole idea. And again, I'm gonna have trouble putting this one into words. I'm like stealing this from one of my friends who brings it up on the show sometimes he basically says, like, isn't it weird that like we're acknowledging the drug war was like a bad thing, and so we legalized weed, but we're going to tax the people that smoke weed to right the wrongs of the drug war.
I
Do you
think that's
follow
an
the
interest.
logic?
Yeah.
I have
You're
trouble putting it into words, but it's like it's interesting how it's like, here I am. I don't mean to say that I was mostly affected by the war on drugs, because I'm like acknowledging my privilege and all that stuff, but like
sure.
B, like just anybody else that has been through this drug war, it's interesting to think that it's like we're the ones getting taxed because we're playing by the rule. It's just an interesting.
Yeah, no,
To your point
it's
though, we've been doing these like Illinois Hash Wednesday episodes, and as you said, taxes were a way to make this policy proposal more digestible. It's like, okay, yeah, you may not agree with weed being legal, but you agree we all need more tax revenue, right? So for some people, it was just a digestible way to make legal weed happen, you know?
Yeah, and it's an interesting conversation too. I mean, not to get like overly into the economics, but
Yeah.
there's like demand economics where like you lower the tax rate, you increase the demand, the revenue generated sufficiently overcomes the
Mm,
reduction. And that's what you see. Like I think when people talk, and I think Michigan has its challenges as a market. Oftentimes people in Illinois are like, man, I just wish this was Michigan. Well, talk to the operators in Michigan 2 years ago, and they would have told you they would have been anywhere else except Michigan. The market is starting to settle out now. It's advantageous for consumers, but the business owners there really struggle to make sufficient margin. But when you look at the tax structure there, when you look at the tax structure in places like Missouri, that is a lot more conducive and consistent to the way alcohol is taxed and some of these other vice spaces are taxed. And the demand is much higher. Illinois got the advantage that we were one of the first like Midwest states, one of the first Midwest states. So we got a lot of cross border traffic that supplemented a lot of the revenue. But as Missouri legalizes, as Wisconsin has a proposal that's out there, as Ohio gets to legalization, as Minnesota has legalization, I think we're going to see some normalization in the revenue generated. And there needs to be then at that point like a real conversation of does a lower effective tax rate ultimately increase the amount of revenue that can be gained.
yeah. Yeah, and I want to get back to price compression here in a second. I think I've got a quote that actually pretty well backs up and proves your point, and that I think will get us back onto defining what we are talking about with regard to price compression. But just for another moment to stay on our tangent,
Yeah, yeah.
you mentioned, that Michigan operators or people even maybe in Oklahoma or Oregon would choose to be anywhere but those places. And I get your logic there, but also at the same time, some of those people wouldn't have gotten the opportunity in Illinois. So it's like,
That's an extremely fair point. Like I'm a
yeah,
believer in like free market capital, like capitalism deciding the number of operators that are in the state. I think the challenge is like how do you maintain patient and customer safety in a unlimited license environment? And Oklahoma is a good example where they've had so many issues with low quality products and mold and things not passing reasonable testing standards. And I think the challenge that we have to get to is where is there a middle ground between unlimited licenses yet a barrier of entry that maintains a quality and a safety standard that allows people to purchase with the confidence that they purchase any other products that are out there. But I don't disagree with you. I think the how limited some of these limited license markets are is very unfortunate. And I think understanding the history of Illinois' legalization and the pilot program and the investments that were made under Ronner by some of these groups is an important component to how some of these structures have rolled out. And it's a lot easier in hindsight to kind of throw shade. But I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is when they did the original pilot program applications, there were not even enough people to apply to fill all the applications. GTI, and you can look this up online, GTI gave back a license to the
right,
state.
right.
There were other folks that were nervous about fulfilling that obligation because there were 10,000 patients in the program. They were giving pounds of flour away and losing, at times hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, which there's privilege, right, in the ability to have enough financial capital to lose money to sit on the sideline. But I think folks don't also realize that, the Illinois program started as a true pilot, that if Ronner decided that he was done with the program, those investments could have gone up, no pun intended, literally in smoke. And
Yeah.
it just so happened that Pritzker was the next person who got elected and things went the way that it did. But I think in understanding the history and cannabis is such a industry so steeped in history that
Hmm.
that's one of the reasons like we start all of our intro to cannabis courses with the history of cannabis, emphasis on marginalized communities, emphasis on impact, legalization, and social equity, but that broader understanding of the history, not just of national drug laws, but even local and state laws and how they feed into some of the challenges of today, I think is really paramount to having a complete discussion on these things.
Yeah. Now, I want to agree with you, and I think you're going to be surprised by my agreement at first, and then you're going to see maybe where I'm going on this. I agree with you that maybe like Oklahoma, Michigan, California, Oregon, they've had like what you might call consumer safety issues as a result of the abundance of operators, both legitimate and illegitimate. Um, I think that's fair, but I also think that thrives because of the fact that you have programs like Illinois, but also let's not even use Illinois, because let's just talk about states that don't even have weed. That's
Yeah,
why it thrives, because it's like, well, Jordan Davidson from Smart Approaches to Marijuana and I have gotten into this, and he's like, well, they said that illegal weed was going to destroy trafficking, but now weed's just trafficked out of California. And it's like, well, yeah, now they don't have to traffic it over the border. They can traffic it out of a state. You know what'll fix that is legalizing it in your state to
right.
supply that demand. Again, demand is just, so I wanted to like lead off with saying that I think you're absolutely right, but I think those problems are caused by prohibition, whether it be the most dramatic form, which is just complete criminalization, or even forms like Illinois, where it's like it's just there's a cap that's keeping prices high. And as a result, black market operators are filling that void. You know what I mean? Just like they always would.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, I'm a big believer, and this is not an idea that's unique to me. I'm a big believer that the correct legalization model for cannabis is tomatoes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Amen.
like right, there's like an FDA structure. There's the ability, Department of Ag and whatnot that monitors. So if you go to a grocery store and you buy tomatoes, there is a level of expectation, right, that it doesn't have salmonella, it wasn't sitting in cow
Right.
shit, like it should be healthy and safe. And when it's not, it makes national news. You also have the option to get local tomatoes, from a regional group that maybe doesn't have the same structure, but is still available. You have the farmer's market option, which you're trusting the farmer. And then you have the
Mhm.
ability to grow the tomatoes in your backyard. I'm a big believer, and I know that you are as well, that like home grow is integral to keeping the industry honest. And I say the industry as not just industry participants, but the government organizations and the oversight bodies,
Yeah.
because I grow better weed than I can buy in most places. There are
Right.
places that have better, but the reality is it's a lot of effort. Most people are lazy, and most people will eventually just default to the lowest common denominator, no different than we even see in like craft beer, right? It's
Right.
like, craft beer as like a home brew, like home brewers didn't kill craft beer. In fact, it like accelerated that industry because it made, the ability to be like famous as a home brewer that eventually turned
Right.
it into a craft brew or
Right.
craft beer brewery. Yeah.
No, well said. Well said. It ended up being like a talent acquisition pool.
Uh, right. Which
You
this
know?
industry struggles to find great talent, particularly on the cultivation side. And how cool would it be? And I've been to some of these as less than legal operations where you get to go and it's like, these are the people, and you get to talk to the person, and you get to understand their grow techniques, and you get to challenge them on why they prefer HPS over
Mhm.
LED. And you're like, oh shit, this is awesome. Like, cool, I'll buy your weed. And then you go and smoke, and you're like, this shit is the best. But that
Yeah,
is like
right.
that's not how the vast majority of consumers consume. And I think the laws have to be written in a way that's like realistic.
Mhm.
And I think the challenge is, and we even saw this with Illinois, is the people writing the laws are not either industry participants or even passionate at times or knowledgeable about the industry. And I'll give an example of that. An associate of mine was part of the recreational bill and provided feedback and direction. And when they were originally putting together the home grow provisions, I believe it was 24 or 25 plants you were going to be allowed to grow. And there was no gifting provision, and there was no selling provision. So they were going to allow individual, people to grow up to 25 plants. When I grow, and I grow in a 4x4 tent with a 2x3 veg, I try to get between a half, around a half pound per plant, between a QP and a half pound to keep them small. If you're doing that across 25 plants on a perpetual cycle, you're producing more than most humans can consume in a reasonable amount of time. And so, like, that to me was a really just strong example, circle it back to education, about the lack of education from the retail point all the way up to the people making the laws, and how that ultimately just creates a challenging dynamic for everybody trying to participate.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, and I think the reason that makes that, like you said, that dynamic gets challenging is exactly the reason we've not seen any movement on adult use, or let's say home cultivation for all adults, because they still don't know the number So let me just put it this way. I've asked operators and people that like lead trade associations, like, will you back a proposal like home grow? You'd get the support from the community to get whatever you need. You know, you want people to call into their legislators, like, here you go.
Yeah,
And their question was, well, how's that going to affect my market? And so, just like you just said, like, if you have 24 plants, is that going to stop you from coming into the dispensary? And my thing is, like, probably not actually, because if I grow like, let's say 12 plants of the same strain, I'm going to have a shit ton of the same strain, as you said. And yeah, I'm going to want to mix it up. So I'm going to go to the dispensary to like grab an eighth here, grab an eighth there, you know, maybe a vape pen or whatever. Like home grow is just meant to supplement. The dispensary is meant, that is the place, yeah, you go to get like connoisseur grade cannabis. I want to try this and that. Like that's how it should be. And then the home grow should just be, you know, something to float you through, like you say, tomatoes.
yeah.
Um,
It's a challenging topic, though, I think, because I think, like, again, I know you're anti-prohibition at all in any way. At least has been my interpretation for the
yeah,
most part. And I think, I'd be curious to understand in the tomatoes example where you go from being okay to sell at farmers markets, but you're not licensed to sell to Kroger or Jewel. Like, what is that threshold where you're producing enough tomatoes where you're not a backyard grower, but you're now a commercial grower? Because I do understand, from a business perspective, if I have to pay all the taxes, all the licenses, all the structure, um, and somebody else can have 500 plants and be running a full scale operation but just selling through farmers markets, that is not a competitive landscape. So I'm in favor of there being some structure with that. But I think, again, like, the reality is that there is a difference between a home grower who communally shares amongst their closest 30 people and somebody who's
right.
selling weed as an income source.
No, but and to your point though, I mean, it's a fair. I think you're bringing up a fair. You know, people like if you're using the tomato model, yeah. At what point do you need a license, and at what point do people feel it's unfair that you're operating without a license,
Yeah,
right? I mean, it's. I think that's accurate. Now, my only thing is, I just hate that part of it, like because I agree, maybe we should draw a line, but I hate that up until we've drawn that line, the answer is criminal penalties.
yeah,
It's
I'm
just
right there
like,
with you.
man, yeah. And that's why I get really frustrated with some of these cannabis operators, because I feel like they can cultivate cannabis legally. And if there's anybody that's going to know, like, I mean, if they're going to try to come up with that number, I guess, like they should be able to do it because they cultivate it legally and they have so much access to the plant, you know. And you'd think, just as somebody in the industry, one of them, they'd be at the front of the line. Like, I view it as fighting for home grow and ending possession limits and stuff like that as fighting for what I deem to be like actual legalization. Because
Yeah,
I just view this as decriminalization, because that is what it is. If you're telling me that if I exceed this, then there's criminal penalties, it's like, oh, okay, so you just decriminalize small amounts.
I think it's a fine line. I mean, I think, again, I think in this discussion, it's important to delineate. There is a threshold, whatever that threshold is, we can debate, but there's a threshold between somebody who is a amateur grower and somebody who is a commercial grower and selling weed for profit.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I think that's, like, if you're talking to an operator who's genuinely concerned about you and I growing weed in our closet, in our backyard, in our basement, competing with their ability to have a viable business, I would encourage that person to go out of business. Because that, like, you have all the resources in the world. In theory, you have professional cultivators, you have better equipment, and if you can't ultimately produce better quality products more consistently at scale than I can in my basement, you shouldn't be doing the job. No different than, again, there's a reason that, Joe's Farmers Market, the guy makes enough tomatoes at a high enough quality to sell just to those people that come in on Sundays. But if he got a PO from Kroger for 7,000 pounds of tomatoes, he would not be able to fulfill it. Like, these are just different leagues. And so I think the big thing is, like, first defining some level of threshold that the culture and the capitalism side agrees with, is like the difference between a home cultivator and a professional or commercial cultivator. And then that then is the kind of the start for the next steps of the conversation.
Yeah. And I think to take it a step further, I just wish that the fines would be in line with like a business offense instead of a criminal offense. Like you were just operating without a license. You're
No
not going to
question.
be in a cage,
But
you know?
some business violations do have criminal penalties for the safety of the public. So like if you're
Sure.
operating a restaurant that's unlicensed, that's producing food that is potentially hazardous to people, like you that can be a criminal penalty. I agree with you. I'm not a fan of anyone going to jail for anything other than like rape and murder and like capital
Yeah.
offenses,
Right.
for the most part. And I think again, like we've just lost this ability, and I think our industry is particularly bad about this in terms of finding a reasonable middle ground and then moving on to the next topic.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the reason we're running up against a gate, and then I promise we're going back to price compression because
No, we can talk
that's the
about anything. I
tangent.
got
But
all in.
um I think the reason we're running up against this is because we're trying to come up with a number with folks that have never listened to the government anyways. You know what I mean? Like what
100%.
it's like
No,
so
100%.
it's to your point, whatever rule they come up with, we're all gonna be like, that's fucking stupid. You know what I mean?
Uh, yes and no, but I think though, like again, like there's going to be people coming out of like the legacy side that are either going to get it or they're not going to get
Yeah.
it. And I think part of getting it is recognizing that like today, if you're an illegal grower, 15 years ago, you're an illegal grower, like you might be passionate as shit about weed, you might love it, you might all those different things. But
Hmm.
unfortunately, like there's societal structures that are going to keep you from getting home loans. They're going to keep you from, if you're a felon, doing certain things in life that like you just fundamentally should be able to do. And part of legalization is the transition from anything goes to some level of structure. And so I think the people who kind of throw their hands up and they're like, I'm just not participating in the legal market, bro. Like at the end of the day, like you're just not going to get those people like to come up to that speed. No different than you're not going to get the people who are on the extreme, conservative side of the argument, like weed should never be legal in any form. And it's just like, okay, like I'm at fundamentally talking to the fringe 10% on both
Right.
sides. And that's not where I want to spend my time. I rather be with the 80% of the people in
Yeah.
the middle that are like much more reasonable. And I
Hmm.
think that transcends even cannabis, right? Like that transcends, I mean, even again, I've found your interesting on sex or your work on sex work interesting as well, where it's just like there is middle ground on every topic if you're approaching things with like empathy to the other side and like the desire to find a solution that you can both live with.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning my series on sex work. I doesn't get the credit it deserves. I
It's
love it.
it's an interesting topic. I mean,
Yeah.
it really is.
Yeah. Well, anyways, I actually pulled up a very short clip that I think provides like my definition of price compression. And I think it matches with what you were saying earlier. So if people forgot, maybe this will jog our memory because
Sure.
we've been on a longer tangent. I wanted
Yeah.
to check when this interview's from. It's from May 8th, 2020. It's featuring Ben Kovler from GTI. So
Okay.
here
There
we
you
go.
go.
We saw and I read Governor Quinn signed a law in 2013 for the medical cannabis pilot program. And I read the law one day and it looked a lot to me like the gaming industry where there were limited licenses for a lot of demand. And that set up as a nice business opportunity. And so I dove in a diligence project to study as much as I could about the industry, traveled to Denver, and decided that the business made sense to invest in. And then along the way, I've learned a ton about the product and the people and other things that we may talk about that have really generated a lot of momentum and things. But that's sort of my background of a finance lens out in California of seeing the industry and seeing it come to viability and diving all the way in.
So we're going to stay a little bit more in the.
Oh, that actually doesn't have one of the parts that I was specifically talking about, which he talks about price compression. I've got the quote written down though. He says, which is what I felt backed up what you said earlier. The core of the brand matters. So Fiji water gets major price protection around that brand, and we can do the same in cannabis. And we think that's where you invest. So I think that's interesting. Like that's how the companies view price compression from a brand perspective. I felt like that was backing up what you were saying earlier. Because as a consumer, I think about it from a different perspective. I think about it as like, what's the general price of an ounce? You know what I mean?
For
Like,
sure. I think though, like what you're keying on there is like the crux of the challenge of cannabis over the next couple of years. And I think, I'm biased. I'm a former employee of GTI, but Ben and Anthony, who run Green Thumb, I think have done a phenomenal job in executing on the strategy that they laid out there. I think there's certainly improvements, but when I think of Incredibles, when I think some of the transitions I've even seen on Rhythm in the last year, Dog Walkers, some of these groups, those are recognizable brands within their markets. I mean, Incredibles was the first commercially available edible I ever had. Mile High Mint Bar out in Denver many years ago.
Yeah.
Dog Walkers, I think, is maybe the only pre-roll brand that people, at least in Illinois, are like tip of the tongue. Yes, that's like the first one. And I think the role of the brand is to really help. I mean, the whole idea of what a brand is to make the consumer shopping experience easier, because you're able to look at this relatively undifferentiated product set and draw your eyes to the brand that your experience has led you up to believe is going to deliver the value that you're looking for. And one of the big things that I would emphasize, and this is something that we talk about with our brand partners all the time, is value is an equation. It's utility divided by price. Utility is the big piece there. So somebody who consumes, and these are just generalizations, but like you and I have been smoking weed a long time. We've always bought weed out of a clear plastic bag or a jar or whatever it is. And so there isn't brand. You ascribe value based off of purely that consumption experience. The only thing that maybe was out there back in the day is, can you stick the nug to the window of the car? If it sticks, you buy it. If it doesn't, you pass. But like, aside from that kind of like old school stuff, there was no brand. The idea of a brand in the future of cannabis is to make it easier for consumers to make choices about what is going to most closely align with the value equation that they're looking for. And so when you are looking at product as undifferentiated, highest THC, highest terpene to lowest dollar, that is one way of evaluating the brand. But you're going to then have to have a labor intensive time anytime you go to shop for cannabis, right? Because you're going to have to really look at the labs. Access to lab reports in dispensaries is abysmal, and I think one of the easiest things to fix in our industry right now. But you're going to have to ask for labs. You're going to have to really trust the bud tenders, and your consumption experience is going to take fundamentally longer than it's going to take for you to pick out dish detergent, because you're a Dawn guy. You've been a Dawn guy your whole life. And when you walk up, you know that Dawn's going to be what you need. You don't have to analyze the set.
Yeah.
That's what brands are ultimately supposed to do for consumers, is make it easier for them to identify the consumption experience, the value prop that they're looking for, and get drawn into that. And that's what really staves off price compression, because if you're just looking at highest THC to lowest dollar, there's no moat. And I think one of the things that Ben, because I've heard that interview, one of the things that Ben talks about is the moat of limited license markets. And why that's important to their strategy is because every business needs a moat. The Cole Memo needs a moat. Seed Talent needs a moat. Because if there's no moat, there's no barrier to entry, then you have, in theory, limitless competition. And that just creates a challenging dynamic to grow a business.
Yeah. Yeah, but I agree with you that that's the moat idea. Another way he said it is, why go play in a knife fight when you could go sit at the beach?
The phraseology on that is certainly interesting.
I mean, it's right, because it's like open, unfettered, just everybody gets a license. It's pretty cutthroat. Yeah, the prices go down. And so, yeah, why go play in a knife fight when you can go sit at the beach? And maybe it's not still the beach, I think is your point. It's not like it's just all la-di-da. But I mean, that's straight from his mouth. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that it's definitely not the beach. And I think we've seen contraction from most of the major operators this year. I think they're learning, and growing to understand it's not the beach. But I also think, I understand to a certain extent the sentiment, from the standpoint of, if you've been out to California and really gotten deep into that market, it literally was cutthroat at times. I mean, there was, Emerald Triangle has not been an easy place to operate, for quite some time. Denver was having issues with a wide variety of both shady operators and illegal cartels that were affecting the industry. And so, yes, it certainly would be easier to go into a market that has more structure for people that are looking to operate more traditional style cannabis businesses.
Yeah. And to just more to your point, shout out to the Chillinois podcast. On July 4th, 2020, Mike Fouché sat down for an interview on the Chillinois podcast. And sometime around, we've got a history document if you're wondering where I'm pulling some of this stuff from.
That's awesome.
Sometime around 27 minutes in, Mike mentions that many people in finance question whether or not the cannabis industry is profitable in the short term or in the long term. He goes on to say that he hears that most people running cannabis companies are running them with the expectation that they'll make their money when they sell their operation.
I don't necessarily agree with that.
That was a long time ago too. I mean,
Yeah.
2020. But what about, just setting that last part aside? Yeah, if it's profitable in the short term or the long term with everything that's going on. I mean, it's
this is an issue that I think spans a lot of discussion. Again, I like no BS. I've watched your content for quite some time, and one of the things that we're really passionate about is supporting entry level workers in cannabis. And I hear a lot of entry level workers in cannabis talking about the profits that these big profiteers are making at these, big MSOs, these big groups. And while there's a lot of money moving through these businesses, and one of the best arguments is, well, they're not making money because they're inefficient. And that argument is sound in certain instances, there's no question. But the reality is too, as we referred to on 280E, many of these businesses will be profitable the moment they can deduct 30%, or so of their revenue as it relates to internal expenses. I mean, most people, again, I just truly don't believe really understand the economic challenges of 280E, safe banking, these different things. Access to capital, you're generally paying higher rates than anyone else. And from the fact that you can't expense things, the only thing you can expense is a COG, so cost of goods sold. So if you buy an item, and this again, you'll have to stop me if I get too far into the weeds. I've been hitting this hash pen most of the call. But most pricing in Illinois is what's called keystoning. So if you buy an item for $50 at the dispensary most likely bought that for $25.
right.
The only thing that they can then deduct in that transaction is the $25 cost of that item. They can't deduct the labor that it took to hand you the item, stamp the item, do all the compliance. They can't deduct the security within the business. They can't deduct the computer they process the transaction on. They can't deduct the rent of the business. I mean, that's outrageous. If there's small business owners that are on, that are listening to the conversation, just imagine basically none of the things that you expense through your business, you can expense. And so for I think a lot of these folks, I think exit and sale was something that when it was like green rush, everybody thinks, you can't lose money in cannabis. There's a lot of really shitty operators that came in. They thought they were going to throw up, some shitty celebrity brand or something like that, and then turn it around to sell it. And you'd always say, well, sell it to who? And they'd be, oh, one of the big CPGs, bro. And it's like, that's like not how that really works. You have to build massive scale to be picked up in traditional CPG, because ultimately what they're buying is a brand with massive scale, not your shitty packaging and your low quality product. I think what ultimately a lot of the MSOs that are still operating successfully have come to understand is they actually have businesses that in theory could be hyper profitable as soon as some of these changes occur from a financial and regulatory standpoint. And I think that's why you're starting to see, Green Thumb has positive EBITDA. That's really exciting. You're seeing some other Chicago-based operators who have gotten to a level of efficiency where they are producing free cash flow from their businesses, even in the constraints that they have today. So if I'm an investor, whether a retail investor or a big time investor, these people are achieving profitability in an environment that I frankly think most CPG folks couldn't last 5 minutes in. And we see that by the number of folks that come into some of these companies at high executive levels and literally don't last 5 minutes because they just fundamentally can't believe the regulatory environment and the financial constraints that's on this business. I've talked to marketers that have come from Miller Coors and some of these big groups. they have, and I've talked to both sides of the fence. The folks have come in from traditional CPG. They're passionate about the plant. They're passionate about the people who consume it. They're willing to learn and change. They knock it out of the park. Dozens and dozens of those examples. And I have equally as many examples, if not more, of people who came in and they didn't give a shit about the plant. They didn't give a shit about the people who consume it. And they didn't even have the understanding, skill set, or flexibility to roll with the challenges that are this industry. And that's what I think is most exciting from my lens, my lens on things is we're seeing some of the best, savviest business operators out there do something that is really challenging with mixed results.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to throw a wrinkle into this discussion. I recently read an article by Brad Spearson, speaking of Grown In.
Yeah.
This is the second time we've mentioned Brad now on the show. Brad, I hope you're listening. Your ears are probably red. So he said a venture capitalist I sat down with recently explained her desire to invest in startups focused on converting federally legal hemp into something that can get you high. The federal government, she surmised, unintentionally legalized cannabis with the 2018 Farm Bill. We are most interested in companies who can exploit this at scale. Brad says this statement is significant on at least two fronts. First off, venture capitalists have been avoiding the cannabis sector for the last 18 months. Any interest in the plant, novel variations or otherwise, is a signal that investor sentiment is warming back up to an industry that normalizes by the day. Secondly, at least as far as this investor is concerned, there is no putting the Delta 8 hemp-derived THC genie back in the bottle. Even if provisions in the upcoming Farm Bill attempt to modify today's Kafkaesque status quo, where some parts of the plant are federally legal and restricted in multiple states, while other variations are federally illegal but sanctioned in nearly 40 states, there will always be workarounds, and at the end of the day, consumers will continue to flock towards legally accessible weed. My question is, it seems like, just come back to price compression, it seems like this has become the most, it's like funny. I've been like bitching about limited licenses for like a few years now. And look, we can, people, I've disagreed with many people on this subject. I've disagreed with people that actually like want the same outcome, but they see a different way of getting to it. So it's okay. Everybody can have their different, but I think it's funny how this wasn't even on my radar, and it seems to have become the strongest challenge of the limited license system. If I could just quickly say what I mean by that is, so, this issue's popped up, and feel free to say it from your side of this too, but this issue's popped up, and I hosted a panel between people in the hemp-derived cannabinoid space and people in the cannabis industry in Illinois that are basically, we had a discussion about what should be the answer to this. And it seemed like the cannabis operators were saying that the CRTA gave them the ability to sell intoxicating cannabinoids, and the Farm Bill is so that you can make if you get an industrial hemp license, then it's just that. It's only for industrial purposes. You can't make any that are, intoxicating. And so these concerns seem to have come from like this story in Uptown where these high schoolers kind of ate edibles or whatever. But then, there's a lot of other concerns about these products not being subject to the same testing, taxing, labeling, and age requirements. So some of these hemp operators came up with a bill where they would be subject to the same taxing, testing, age requirements, labeling, all that. And basically, and I brought that up during the panel, and basically the participants in the cannabis industry said no, because it would dilute the value of the license, and that these license limitations and everything that like if we were just to give all these licenses to hemp operators, that we would have price compression and everything that we've been talking about this entire time. And so it's just interesting. I'm just curious, what do you think about this whole hemp? I know I just threw a lot at you. What do you think about this whole hemp thing that's come up? And also, do you agree with me that it seems like it's like one of the things that actually seems to be almost, not yet, but almost throwing a wrench in this limited license system?
I definitely agree with that last statement that it's throwing a wrench into the system. I mean, I think anytime I'm looking at policy changes or these types of things, I always get back to the question that we talked about in the first few minutes, which is who does it serve?
Mhm.
Obviously, if I own a THC based dispensary today, I don't want more competition. Like that is so logical that it should never be. And like one thing that I have is just like a general rule of thumb is like that if somebody is acting selfishly, which I think sometimes sounds bad, but selfishly also can just mean in your own self interest. I can rationalize that immediately because that is kind of how people are, right? Generally, people are self-interested. And so when somebody says something like, I own a cannabis dispensary license and I don't want additional license or additional people to be able to compete with me, I say, thank you for your perspective. That makes a ton of sense from your perspective. I believe that the rules and the regs and the laws should really be focused on what's best for consumers. That's to me is like the role of government in regulating trade should be in consumer protection, consumer interest. That's one bucket of it. The second bucket is like just hemp and the challenges that are associated with that. And I was just up in Minnesota last week. They have probably one of the most unique structures around cannabis laws that you can have in the country in terms of being able to buy basically anything 5 milligrams or less, and with any license that allows the sale of alcohol. I also believe in consumer free choice and free will and the ability for you to get what you want. But I also have driven a car and realized how dumb the general populace is at so many things, just watching people's inability to follow basic traffic rules and regulations. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. But like government, I think, should do things within reason to protect the people. Protect is a really dangerous word because things can happen super bad and super fast in the name of protecting people. But the idea that you can go buy 1,000 milligram hemp derived, even Delta 9 chocolate bar from a gas station is unsafe and inappropriate, in my opinion. Not because I wouldn't know how to consume it, not because you wouldn't know how to consume it, but the vast majority of people have never been educated on this. And I think the challenge, because sometimes people make the parallel to alcohol. Well, alcohol, you can do all these things. Alcohol, you can overdose. But alcohol has 100 years of cultural and societal norms associated with it, such that people see their parents or their grandparents, having a glass of wine from the time they can even remember to, the time they decide whether they're 15 years old or 21 years old to start consuming. And I think true cannabis passionate folks have to understand and accept where the country is at today and be a part of shepherding it into the societal acceptance of tomorrow. And so if there is, to me, it's, the solution is some rules and regulations around labeling requirements, education, where you can sell to minors, basically the same regulations that are out there as it relates to vape, or some of these other things that are potentially newer entrants to the vice markets. Let's start that because I agree that cannabis shouldn't be more penalized than tobacco and nicotine. But let's start with the same regulation as that's there. Hold then folks accountable for the safety standards that are going to ultimately put consumer and patient safety first. And then let's let the market decide, do people derive more value from going to the dispensary than they do from, 7-Eleven and buying the shit, from over there. And I think that's one of the big passion pieces for me that really frustrates me about this industry is because there's so many challenges with compliance rules and regulations, people then decide that can then be the scapegoat for all of their ineffectiveness as a business. And you can't legislate your way into being a good operator. You either are or you aren't. And if you are, you will adjust with the changes in the regulations and you will produce so much value in your customer coming to your dispensary that they will drive past a 7-Eleven, a GNC, and a Sarah's Health Food Shops that all sell health food stuff because you've created a destination for consumers that adds sufficient value to then ultimately supplement that price.
Yeah. Yeah, dude. I mean, to your point, I'm looking this drink that I've been drinking, like I got it from the Benny's, and it's a it's a hemp derived drink with 25 milligrams of THC in it. It's like, now we're
And if that
talking.
actually slapped like a 25 milligram, like real full dose, and you were Joe average consumer who, smoked weed a couple times in high school, you would probably not be safe driving,
Yeah.
but you're not. And so it's totally fine. And that's the reality of the challenge that I think we're working to solve.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I was just bringing that up to your point of access. Like if these
Yeah.
dispensaries are worried about like access, just like compete on that. Like it's just convenient for me to go and grab this drink. And that's the reason I did it. If it was more convenient at the dispensary, I would. But back to your point, I mean, I get it for sure. I mean, I literally had this guy on this show and he's going to roll out 100 milligram drink. And one of his main concerns is like, yeah, how do we do this? So what's cool is the way he's approaching it is like the standard can size is a standard dose, like 10 milligrams.
Yeah.
Then you got this skinny can that's 25 milligrams. And then the 100 milligrams is probably going to be like a tall boy or something like that.
Yep.
So it's like indicative and kind of they're trying to set that standard that you were just
Yep.
talking about. And I get what you're saying. If somebody grabs the wrong can, and I hate to use the exact point that you said I was going to use, but like, yeah, like as far as anything that you can buy in Benny's, that would be the least of my concerns of people walking out with,
Without a doubt. But right,
you
there's
know,
cultural context
yeah.
around consuming whiskey or grain alcohol. I don't know this person, but I've been following their entrepreneurial journey for a while, and I know I'm only a couple of connections away. But there's a new seltzer brand that's come up in the last couple of years called System Seltzer.
Hmm.
It's a Chicago-based group. The guy who's one of the founders, Anthony Spina. I've never met him. Not a plug. Don't. But
Yeah.
whatever. I followed his entrepreneurial journey because he saw an opportunity within the NA space where, similar to like whatever the hell the water company is that everybody loves because they're in the cans.
Liquid Death.
Liquid Death.
Yeah.
Similar to Liquid Death, I think he recognized an opportunity where it's like people want to have NA, but they don't want to stand out and look like they're, the loser drinking, a bottle of water in the corner. So
Hmm.
they're the exact same cans of seltzer, but you can get 0%, like 2%, 5%, and like 8% alcohol.
Mm.
Like, and then there's levels of education that happen on the box to like help you understand how you can consume this, how it can fit like your consumption pattern. I think creative solutions like that are really interesting ways where it's like if the dude you had on the show had a gigantic sticker on the top that said
Hmm.
like high dose, proceed with caution, like normal dose is 1/10 of this,
Yeah.
like that then is some step towards education. And again, there's so much education that circles back in these conversations. And again, I'm not like a traditional learning and development person, but I couldn't be more passionate about what we're doing at Seed Talent because almost every conversation that we've had has looped back to insufficient education of somebody involved in the process, leading to an outcome that is negatively
Bingo.
impacting the industry.
Bingo. I was about to say that's the outcome. That's like your worst fear, right? Somebody takes something based on their incorrect understanding of something and then creates this, you know how it is. It could create this scary headline and it's like, hold on a second.
No different than the headline from the kids up in the north side of the city. It's like, kids dosed, sending to ER, like overdosed on cannabis. It's like you and I saw that and said, yeah, for sure. Like I'm sure they were super overdosed on this thing that you can't overdose on.
Right.
Um, and then but it's like every step in that process, there was lack of education on the kids, lack of education on the people who sold them the product, lack of education for the reporter who wrote the story, like
Mhm.
so much lack of education. And that's why I think, have had the success that we've had, albeit we're like in the first inning, is the ability to be able to just get people to say, you know what, my staff, this industry could use more knowledge. If we can just agree on that, that's an awesome spot to find common ground.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Yeah. So what have you tried any of these hemp products? Have you ever?
Yeah, I in fact, somewhere around here. We just got some from a customer who is a THC legal, and this is one of the other sides of the coin, is a lot of these national brands are now switching to a version that has hemp derived
So
as well.
right, then that's what I was about to say. I actually pulled up a tweet from you probably know this dude, Chris Becker from Honeybee Collective. I don't know if you're
I know
familiar,
of
but
him. I don't know him. Yeah.
he's cool guy. He's been on the show a few times, and he basically tweeted the other day. He said, "Just talk to a bank that will take deposits from and providing." Sorry, restart that. Just talk to a bank that will take deposits from and provide funding for Farm Bill authorized businesses, including those that sell THCA hemp. He said, between that, the Farm Bill extension, state prohibitions on hemp being decimated in court, the hemp space is almost irresistible. And, all those things you were talking about earlier, 280E, taxes, go down the list, hemp. That's interesting to hear that you've heard the same thing where these big operators, I mean, we've seen it. Cookies is in the hemp space. GTI, you could say, is indirectly in the hemp space because the drink that the brand that they sponsor is in Minnesota.
Yeah, there's truth to that. I mean, Select has some hemp products that are out in the market. Yeah, again, I think it's going to be an interesting avenue to do that. I think it's also an interesting conversation, though, between some of these brands and some of their retail partners. If I'm a dispensary operator that then is watching this brand that I've helped build sell direct to consumer and basically cut me out of that transaction, I'm having a very different relationship with that brand moving forward. And again, I think there's so many different parallels of this outside of the industry. But it's like, if you're a retail partner and you're working with a brand, that is a relationship. And you as a retail partner have to do a great job representing that brand, a great job educating on that brand. But in return, there is a responsibility of that brand to look out for the retail partner and to be a good partner. And I think some of the conversation that is insufficiently being had is, while this is really good for some of the brands, particularly in their need to get capital, it's really potentially negative if I'm a consumer of tablet A and I've been going to dispensary A to buy that for the last 5 years, and all of a sudden I can now buy it online direct to consumer, and I'm no longer going in and supporting that retail partner. That's an interesting challenge as a retailer, I think, to overcome. And it gets back to the value of, if you're just handing people product across the counter and that's your retail strategy, you will be going out of business. It's not if, it's when.
Yeah, but some of these things that you're talking, like, I feel like that idea, the idea of dealing with the difficulties of purchasing it online and the difficulties of having to just fight against everybody that once they have the ability to participate, are inevitabilities that we're having to deal with in society. And we're trying to stave them off through these artificial restrictions.
Yes, I think that's so true for so many things that are going on, even outside.
It's like, I understand when I was going to play the clip of Governor Pritzker explaining why we've limited licenses earlier, because we want to keep it profitable. In other words, prevent price compression. I get it. I think it's what are we being silly to pretend that it's like other states are preparing, like Oregon and California? And I know they're much more mature than us. I know that that's probably a valid point to bring up, but they're preparing for an export market. They're just waiting for the Cole memo to no longer be a thing. And I don't mean the show. I mean the guidance that prevents them from exporting.
Yeah. I mean, the largest cultivator in California has funded their entire grow operation on pitch decks that talk about cross-country sale.
Really?
I think one of the things that is fascinating about that discussion, though, is it'll be easier and more profitable in theory to grow weed in places that it naturally should occur. Central America, South America, some of those places.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, if you look at the cannabis market in South America, for the most part, that continent is being set up as an export market to grow large volumes of outdoor cannabis, process it into distillate or isolates, and then ship that product across the world. And that's where I think some of these groups, again, that are coming to market with just purely isolate or distillate based products, and believe that that is a differentiated product, are going to run into challenges.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another one, I don't even know if you know about this. We can start to close here pretty soon, but this is another thing I read on Twitter that I thought was interesting the other day. I don't know anything about intellectual property. I just want to say that really quick.
Sure.
But they say, let's not forget the tricky situation of protecting a cannabis business intellectual property. For goods or services that are plant touching, marks cannot be registered because of federal scheduling in the CSA. Registrants must show that their desired mark relates to a product or service that has a use beyond cannabis. Hemp was legalized. You know where this is going. A business creating products or services related to hemp would be able to register a mark. It says those products or services might also be used in the inhalation or topical application of cannabis. Again, that's getting a little bit too granular. I can't speak to that, but just on the face, the idea that, so I texted that to somebody and they said, get your hemp license and just start registering a bunch of copyrights for cannabis things. Like just start squatting on little terms. There goes the idea. But I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thought. I'm just sitting here.
No, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today is kind of just a myriad of challenges created by
Right.
the compliance, the regulation. And again, I think so much of that stuff ties back to the education of the people who are making these laws. And I think that, again, the big thing, and I don't know how to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound like weird, but I would encourage you, because I know you talk to a lot of legislators and things like that. There's one question, whether you're talking to operators, legislators, that puts people back a little bit and gets a real answer, which is, who does this serve? And
Yeah.
it's not like in a finger wag, who does this serve? It's like a general, like, so really understand that, appreciate that. So, who does this serve? So if you can't register a trademark for, a cannabis brand, who benefits from that?
Yeah.
And the honest to God response is literally no one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or like the only reasonable answer is like, it benefits these large CPG companies that are essentially going to steal these trademarks from brands that are already built. There's a conspiracy theory that I actually find extremely intriguing about the legalization challenges and why safe banking has been so slow. So I'm a big believer in follow the money. Vast majority of illegalization has been funded by pharmaceutical companies in the industrial prison complex. That has been the case for quite some time. But one of the other conversations or discussions or things that's going on around the particularly the tax structure, particularly some of these things, is that these are designed to stress the market, understand what works, where works, what doesn't work, put businesses out of business that are not in a certain mold. And then that will essentially create an acquisition funnel of sound businesses to be bought by big CPG and big pharma. And then what do? They turn on the lobbying machine, change all the regulations that fuck these businesses over after they've had basically the market proven out by an outside operator. And it's a compelling argument in the sense that when you say, who does this serve? A lot of the answers start to link back, and you're like, and again, I'm not like as conspiracy theory as some, but when it's logical and when you follow the pattern and when you're so invested in the industry like we are, you see these things. And I even get back to like Monsanto. Monsanto and Scotts are the largest cannabis operators in the world. They are investors in cannabis businesses. They are investors and owners in cultivation centers, they are collecting so much data on all these different strains, all these different things. When you get back to intellectual property, one of the things that Monsanto is known for, and if folks aren't aware of this, I would encourage, smoke a couple joints, not one, a couple, because it's so depressing. And go read about Monsanto patenting their genetics. And then what they do is they sue these farmers all over the world, all over the country, for stealing their genetics because a bee went from one spot to the other and carried their genetics. That's the shit that scares, the hell out of me about this industry. And that's where I get a lot of frustration. While I understand the arguments, I get a lot of frustration, and I do not absolve some of the operators of some of the things they've done. There are things that have been inexcusable and or excusable in the sense that these people are operating sometimes the biggest businesses they've ever ran and are fundamentally gigantic startups. And as somebody who's founded a startup, it is really difficult. And I don't think enough people talk about how difficult it is. But the reality is the people who are operating these businesses today, the biggest ones, are shit stains on the scale of some of these multinational conglomerates that are ultimately CPG, big big pharma. And I think if our industry, and maybe this is a nice kind of segue towards the end of the conversation, if our industry doesn't educate itself on our industry, doesn't advocate for what is good for all with an understanding of how it affects and who benefits, we're going to get crushed by real big business as soon as any meaningful change happens in legalization. And that's one of the passion points for me, is I want us to build an industry together that's so strong, that's so defensible, that is so backed and rooted in education, that it's not just a matter of slapping a Coca-Cola label over can and then you're on to the next thing, but that we've built a community, to go full circle here, where people go, we're going to buy from those legacy brands. And by legacy brands, it could still be the Crescos and the GTIs, because in the grand scheme of things, it's legacy in comparison to Frito-Lay and Pepsi. And people are going to advocate and look out, and they're going to support dispensaries that are adding value. They're going to support their neighbor that's home growing and learning how to do the process. And we're going to get back to the point that the best thing that people talk about with cannabis is the community of people that it serves and the community of people that serve it.
Well said. Well, Kurt, I'd love to have you back on the show in the future.
I'd love to come back. This is
cool.
my favorite shit to talk about.
Sweet. I was gonna say I had a good time today. I was hoping that you did too.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
cool. Well, folks, I hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did. As far as all this goes, Kurt, if you don't hear from me, but you have something that you'd like to talk about before you hear from me, just holler. And if not, you'll hear from me again. We'll definitely chop it up and smoke some more on the Cole memo. So
yeah, absolutely. Sounds good. Thank you, sir.
yeah, it's been a pleasure. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.